The night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn, and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical chances, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said Herbert, without looking up from the board. "Check. I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst." In the midst of a friendly game's aftermath, their visitor arrived. Sergeant Major Morris, a tall, burly man with beady eyes and a ruddy complexion, shook hands with Mr. White and, having partaken of the family's hospitality, sat before the fire. After the third glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk. The little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old lady. "What's that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" The sergeant major reached into his pocket and held out a small, dried-up object. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His face had gone white. "I've had my 3 wishes already." Morris threw the paw upon the fire. Mr. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens." He took his leave shortly after, and despite the soldier's warnings, the old man turned the paw over in his fingers. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he was telling us," said Herbert, with his hand on his father's shoulder, "we shall not make much out of it." "What shall you wish for, father?" inquired his mother. Mr. White thought carefully. £200, he said at last. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words. As Mr. White held the monkey's paw and wished aloud, the paw twisted in his hand like a snake. "It moved," he cried, dropping it to the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, laughing, "and I bet I never shall." Herbert went to work next morning, and in the brightness of the wintry sun, the old couple laughed at their fears. Herbert had rather spoiled their breakfast by saying that he wished it would come in installments. But when evening fell, the mother grew nervous and started at every sound. At last she rose and went to the door to watch for her son coming home. She heard Herbert's cheerful whistle in the road, but it was not Herbert. It was a stranger, well-dressed and dapper, who, with a certain hesitation, knocked and was admitted. He began slowly, with great circumlocution, to explain his business. He glanced furtively at Mrs. White as he spoke, and she began to feel uneasy. Her husband took her hand between his own and pressed it as the stranger, still looking at the floor, said quietly that her son had been caught in the machinery At work that morning, he was in the hospital. The man raised his head and looked at the stricken woman, then faltered. The firm of Ma and Megan's wished to present their condolences, together with a sum of 200 pounds. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead. They came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen. Something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old woman, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out her hand and found herself alone. The room was in darkness. She could hear her husband downstairs, moving quietly. She dressed and descended. He was sitting in the armchair, gazing into a dying fire. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Come back to bed," she said gently. He turned. In the dim light, his face looked strange. "The paw," he whispered. "We still have 2 wishes. We've only had 1, said Mrs. White quickly. She sat beside him and watched his hands. The first wish was granted. Why not the second? He's been dead 10 days. And besides, I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back," said the old woman, and dragged him towards the mantelpiece. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" She caught the old man's hand and pressed it upon the paw. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman dropped to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling, into his chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed. He was awakened by a fusillade of knocks upon the front door. In the darkness of the staircase, his wife felt her way down. "What's that?" she cried. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert," she screamed. "It's Herbert." She ran to the door, but her husband was before her. "For God's sake, don't let it in," he cried, grasping her arm. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old man, with a wild cry, reached down into the darkness and found the monkey's paw. Even his wife's voice could not stop him now. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chain rattle back and the bolt drawn slowly. Then the old woman's long, loud wail of disappointment. He rushed to her side. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.